Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. For those of you with backyard caneberries, that would be blackberries, boysenberries, and raspberries, for example, fall is the time to do some maintenance on those sprawling vines for a lot of good reasons, and not the least of which is to help ensure a large crop of berries for the following spring and summer. We talk with a master gardener berry expert about pruning, fertilizing, and caring for your backyard berries in the fall. And if you enjoy listening to the gardening advice of America's favorite retired college horticultural professor, Debbie Flower, well, you've learned a lot from her over the years. In today's episode, I get Debbie to do a deeper dive on some topics or terms that she's mentioned in the past, usually while talking about another subject. And those mentions, I think, could use some further explanations. Things like, well, just how do you sterilize soil in the kitchen oven, if you dare? Where are those unwanted cool spots in a hot compost pile? And at what point in a plant's life do you add soil nutrition if that plant is in a seed-starting potting mix? And, I really still want more clarification on her method of starting seeds in a paper towel. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go. We're here at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. It's an open garden Wednesday, and it's fall. And there are some wonderful berries here in barrels, growing in barrels, blackberries and boysenberries. They look excellent, but it's sort of the end of the season, so what should you be doing with blackberries and boysenberries at this point in time in the fall? We're talking with Ann Moore. Ann is a Sacramento County Master Gardener, and Ann, I really like the fact that these are being grown in barrels. What are the advantages of growing blackberries or any caneberry in a barrel?
The obvious reason is it creates space that you might not have in your garden. It also can help you with invasiveness because these plants can really spread, so the barrel is going to give you a barrier for that happening. But in our case in particular, we also are dealing with a problem we have with the underlying soil. We have a problem that's somewhat common in our area called crown gall, which is really a problem for caneberries, and we experience it here. So we put brick down and put barrels on top. We're able to grow in an area that otherwise wouldn't have been healthy for caneberries.
And you talked about the benefits of growing blackberries and boysenberries in barrels. Can you get away with planting these in smaller containers? And if so, how small can you go?
I wouldn't recommend it. I think it's a little bit challenging for these plants to be in containers, but they're doing okay. And actually, I'm hoping that we'll have more canes coming up and we'll have more going on here. And I think a smaller container would really interfere with that.
It looks like these barrels are about 24 to 26 inches across and about 24, 26 inches high.
Yeah, I think that's a good size. I would stay with that if it were me.
Last time I looked at a nursery, there was no specific blackberry soil. So what sort of soil do you recommend?
We just use normal soil. I know you might want to investigate if there's other soils that help you retain moisture because of that can be a problem with containers. But we've been happy with just regular potting soil that we certainly add fertilizer to and other amendments.
And I want to point out something very obvious here, but I don't want to overlook it. These barrels have drainage.
Absolutely. That's essential. Yeah. And we really do monitor what the moisture is. We use a moisture meter to make sure that they're nice and moist, but not too moist.
Are blackberries and boysenberries a little bit like blueberries in that they prefer an acidic soil?
Somewhat, not to the same extent, but they like slightly acidic soil. Our pH in the area tends to be around 7. They like between 5.5 and 6.5. So it's close enough where you can get away with not dealing with it, but we really like to add a little bit of sulfur just to get them to their happiest place.
All right. Well, these look happy, but it is fall, and so it's sort of the end of the production season. What is the best things to be doing for these caneberries in the fall so that you have a super-duper crop next year?
2 things. pruning, which we're going to talk about a little bit now, and then we're going to have a workshop later on today here at the Hort Center. And 2, we'll add fertilizer and a little bit of sulfur to adjust the pH.
What sort of fertilizer would you use in a barrel growing a caneberry, realizing that barrels probably have to be fertilized a little bit more often because of the fact that a lot of that fertilizer is getting leached out quicker than it would in the ground?
Right. We use normal fertilizer. We have other caneberries going in the ground, but with the barrels, we've just changed over to a regimen of adding half-strength diluted fish emulsion and kelp emulsion, and we actually do it almost monthly when we can if it's not too hot. And we've learned that from some experts we have in our orchard area and people that we know from some of the major cultivators of caneberries. Because there's so much water going through these barrels, it just really leaches the soil out a lot kind of quickly. So we're really happy with this new change. We think our plants are looking a lot more vigorous this year, and we're expecting them to even be better next year.
Yeah, fish emulsion doesn't have much nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium. Usually fish emulsion is 5-1-1. And the kelp meal or the seaweed has micronutrients, which help out a lot in terms of rooting and just for overall strength and vigor. With the fish emulsion, I know that right there in the bottle, it talks about fertilizing on a regular basis with it because it is so weak. And I would imagine you even probably cut that down a little bit.
We do have strength. Yeah, and water really well before, add it, water really well after. And we're really careful about not doing it if it's a horribly hot day because we just don't want to burn their roots.
Now, you mentioned that pruning is very important, and I would think that one of the common reasons for pruning berries is because to get new growth, new berries the following year, it has to be growing on new wood.
Well, the way caneberries grow, and I'm talking about blackberries and boysenberries and other variations like alala berries, huckleberries, their root is actually perennial, but their canes are biennial. So the root can live for a very long time. We have plants here that are 20 years old. The plants in our barrels were planted 2019, so they're younger. But anyway, growing from that root, you have a first-year cane that comes up, which we call the primocane, first-year cane, and that's basically the structure. And the second year, that cane then is mature enough to become a floricane, flora, i.e., flowers and berries. So the new growth, the first year growth, is actually creating the structure. The second year growth, with some exceptions, which we can talk about later on, there are some varieties that don't follow this pattern, but the second year growth is where you find where the berries happen, and they happen on the laterals that grow off of that primocane. So what you're doing now is you should be pruning by now if you have these kinds of caneberries. We want to go in and take out the second year canes because they're done. And we just want to get them out. And then we're going to be pruning the remaining canes, which are the primocanes, and creating the structure on our trellis that will be producing fruit next year.
Smart Pots are the original award-winning fabric planter. They're sold worldwide. Smart Pots are proudly made 100% in the USA. Smart Pots are also BPA-free. There's no risk of chemicals leaching into the soil, your herbs, vegetables, and other edibles. That's why organic growers prefer Smart Pots. Smart Pots' breathable fabric creates a healthy root structure for plants. Smart Pots come in a wide array of sizes, and they can be reused year after year. Speaking of the cold weather that's on the way, if a frost or freeze is in the forecast, moving your frost-tender plants that are in the Smart Pots that have handles makes them even easier to move closer to the house for added warmth, or you could even move them inside for the winter. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight fabric containers. It's Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred for more info and that special Farmer Fred discount on your next Smart Pot purchase. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. Yeah, I guess we should clarify for everybody that these berries, blackberries and boysenberries growing in barrels, aren't just flopping all over the place. You've created this trellis that runs the length of the row of the barrels with what looks like, 1, 2, 3, 4 wires running across.
And then one way up.
And then one way up at about 6.5, 7 feet. And you got T-posts on the end. I mean, big wooden T-posts, by the way, for support. It's almost like building a kiwi structure, the strength of it that you have with these 4x4s at either end and a steel pipe running the length of the barrels, growing the berries. And so what you're talking about is kind of like climbing roses. You grow first for the structure, and then you start tying the laterals off to the wires.
Correct. Now, our structure is pretty wonderful. I mean, not every home gardener is going to have the wherewithal to maybe do this. There's a lot of other ways you can create trellises, but you do need some kind of support system that you can prune to so that you can just contain and manage the growth of your berries.
Yeah, and the wires, by the way, besides going up and down the 4x4, that's the center post, there's a 2x4 running perpendicular to the barrels, and there are wires hooked to the outside of that crossbar that are running maybe 2-3 feet away from the berries. But I think that serves a very good purpose, that if you're trying to protect the berries from too much sun or heat, you could throw a row cover over it.
And we do, absolutely. We have to, otherwise we'll lose a lot of berries to the sun. We also will drape the laterals because they'll get really long and crazy as time goes on. So we'll drape the laterals over there, and that actually allows more air circulation too, if you can spread everything out a little bit.
Well, that was a good scenic bypass. But getting back to the pruning, do you have to remove all the secondary branches?
Yes. They're done. Okay. They're absolutely done. So you just want to, you can leave them there if you want, but it just creates problems that could attract disease or just reduce air circulation and just make this a tangled mess. So it'd be horrible to deal with. But yeah, you cut them all the way to the ground.
All the way to the ground. I bet if you're thrifty, you could probably take those cuttings and root them.
I would recommend using primocanes, but we're also going to be pruning as well, and they're more vigorous. And I would recommend instead rooting the tips of the primocanes.
Okay, because it's a thicker branch.
And they're new, and they're all about growing. Yeah. So whereas the second year canes, they're done. They're in their dying stage. So I wouldn't go there.
I would think cleanup is an important part of the whole fall process of taking care of blackberries and boysenberries, just because you want to prevent overwintering pests.
Absolutely. Now, once you take all those canes out, those second-year canes, there's still more pruning to do.
Oh, never ends.
No. Then what you want to do is take your remaining primocanes, the first-year canes, and you want to top them at the level that works for your trellising situation. So we would top them at probably about 5 feet, which is where this really thick pole is, and then tie them up. So you've got a vertical primocane. You don't want upward growth because that's not where the fruit happens. It happens on the laterals. So you're forcing the plant to grow laterals. And then if you have any laterals, we'll see. It's hard to tell until you start pruning this. But if you have any laterals coming off those primocanes, we will go ahead and trim those to 12 inches or so. And they will keep growing. There'll be so much growth by the time the season comes next year. But we're just trying to sort of control the growth, keep it where it's manageable, and force the growth to the laterals rather than upward growth.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there may be some exceptions to all this as far as berry production, because it sounds like if you bought some of these berry varieties, you'd be waiting 2 or 3 years before you would get berries.
2 years.
2 years. Yeah. Okay. So what are those exceptions?
Well, there's another variety, more common in raspberries, which I haven't talked about too much, but we also have an example here of a blackberry. It's called an ever-bearing blackberry. And those berries actually have 2 crops per season. They actually have a crop on the primocanes the first year. At the very end of their season, they'll fruit. And then if you just top that, but leave that cane for the following year, it'll have a second crop on the lower part of the cane.
Fruiting season, when you can pick them, is generally what, summer?
The primocane, the first year will be in the fall. In fact, we can see some fruit still on this plant here that's an everbearing. And then when you prune it early next summer, that same cane will have fruit.
In the fall?
In the spring, yeah. Spring to early summer, yeah.
It depends where you live, folks.
Yeah, it certainly does.
Well, let's talk about some of those particular varieties that might give you some fruit from the primocanes. What are some of those varieties?
Well, right here we have...
let's walk over and see it.
This is called a Prime Arc Freedom Thornless Blackberry. And you can see here that this fruit down here, this is the second year fruit. If we search around here, we can see somewhere where we pruned it. So we're going to cut that all the way down to the ground. And then here, we have some fruiting up here, and this was on the primocane. So we're going to prune this down to here, and then we'll have laterals come out here and grow fruit early next summer.
Which coincidentally, where that level is there's a wire running throughout the barrels at that level as well. So you're basically pruning it back to the level of a wire to tie it to.
Correct, yeah.
How do you tie it to a wire?
Just simply with garden tape. Yeah, something that won't cut into the plant, and yeah, not a problem.
Now, a lot of people, when they think of blackberries especially, or even boysenberries, they think, oh, I don't want to deal with all those thorns. But there are thornless varieties.
Absolutely. Most of our varieties are thornless. We do have a couple plants with thorns, but a lot easier to prune if you don't have those thorns.
Coming up this winter, we'll talk about raspberries with Ann Moore, Sacramento County Master Gardener. Ann, thanks for talking fall berry care.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
If the segment you just heard about fall berry care has piqued your interest in growing backyard caneberries, you'll enjoy the flashback episode of the week. It's number 182, Growing Raspberries, Boysenberries, and Blackberries. It featured Master Gardener Pam Bone, and it's one of the top 10 most listened to episodes in the Garden Basics library, offering great tips about planting, supporting, watering, fertilizing, and pest control for caneberries. Go back and give it a listen. It's episode 182 from April of 2022, called Growing Raspberries, Boysenberries, and Blackberries. Find a link to it in today's show notes or at the podcast player of your choice, and you can also find it at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. Are you thinking of growing fruit trees? Maybe you already are, but you want to know more about them. Well, you probably have a million questions, like which fruit trees will grow where I live? What are the tastiest fruits? When's harvest time? How do I care for these trees? The good news is the answers are all nearby. Just go to davewilson.com, click on the Home Garden tab at the top of the page. And in that Home Garden tab, you're going to find a link to their fruit and nut harvest chart so you can be picking delicious, healthy fruits from your own yard for a long growing season. Here in USDA Zone 9, that could be May through December. And you're just a click away with the informative YouTube video series at davewilson.com. As part of that video series, they'll walk you through the simple process of using the Dave Wilson website to find their trees either at a nearby local nursery or at a mail order source. That's Dave Wilson Nursery, the nation's largest grower of fruit trees for the backyard garden. They've got planting tips, taste test results, and information about their revolutionary backyard orchard culture techniques. That'll explain how you can have a cornucopia of different fruit trees in a small backyard. Your harvest to better health begins at davewilson.com. Here on the Garden Basics podcast, Debbie Flower is joining us, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor. Debbie and I have been doing a little dog and pony show. Well, okay, we've been out giving speeches to garden clubs and garden groups. And sometimes when you're talking out to an audience, you know, you say things and you might say something and move on to the next thing to talk about and not really explain something that may cause some confusion in people's minds. Raise questions. So we're calling this segment, Debbie, please explain this. Back in episode 275, we were talking about green potatoes and whether they were safe to eat. And Debbie said this.
Yeah, the green part is chlorophyll. We eat lots of chlorophyll. Celery's chlorophyll, full of chlorophyll. Any green vegetable, broccoli, full of chlorophyll. But it's when it's bitter and has a solanine buildup in it. Potatoes have solanine in them anyway to some level, and it becomes more increased and more active when they start to green up. They make chlorophyll and become metabolically active. He also asked about how to dispose of the parts that you don't want anymore. The compost pile works just fine. Be aware that if it isn't a hot compost pile and they don't break down, even little pieces, especially little green pieces, can begin to grow in the inactive portions of a compost pile. And once you have a potato bed, you have potatoes growing there forever, because the little pieces of roots underground don't decompose, and you don't harvest them all, and so they just keep growing every year. But yes, definitely you can put them in the compost pile, the worm bin, something like that. They are an organic that will break down.
So Debbie, I would like you to explain, where are these inactive portions of a compost pile?
Okay. Compost pile should be 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep to be effective and become hot. And what happens is, if it has enough oxygen and some moisture, just enough to be like a wrung out sponge, the microorganisms live in the center of that pile. That's the hot portion of the pile. And everything around it stays cool. Too cool for too cool for plant parts and seeds and things like that to die. And so it's the outer portion of the compost pile that stays cool. What you want to do is turn it regularly. You're turning it regularly for a couple of reasons. One is for those outer portions that still contain plant material that's not broken down to get into the center and become broken down, but also to provide oxygen for those microorganisms to live and do the work that they do to make compost.
So in this particular example, we were talking about how solanine forms on potatoes, and you don't want to eat solanine. If you do have a potato that is popping up from the cooler sections of a compost pile, will that new potato have solanine?
Only if it's exposed to light. Light is needed on the potato. Potato is a stem and therefore can become green, can make chlorophyll. It is not a root. Roots can't make chlorophyll. It is a stem. And so when that stem is exposed to light, it will form chlorophyll, and that is an indication it is also forming solanine.
So in this conversation we've been having about solanine in this episode, you happen to mention that some people are particularly sensitive to solanine.
Yes.
And you said this.
All the plants in the Solanaceae family, eggplant, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, tobacco, all have solanine in them to different levels. Some people are particularly sensitive to solanine. My husband happens to be one of those. His sister is another one of those people, and it exacerbates his arthritis. And there is a whole book written about that by a professor that I had at Rutgers. For some of us, it isn't a bother. So all poisonousness, all toxicity has to do with amount. So it's only when you're going to have a large amount of solanine that it's a problem.
My question to you in regards to this, did you have a professor in college who made you buy his book as a textbook, charging you a gross amount of money?
No, actually, the book hadn't been written by then.
Oh.
He was my fruit professor. So we learned about tree fruits primarily in his class. There was a different guy for like blueberries and things. Rumor is, and I only know it as rumor, that when he retired, he was not offered emeritus status at Rutgers, which is where I went to my undergraduate degree. But he was offered it at Florida, some college in Florida, and he wrote the book then, after he retired.
Did you ever have a professor who made you buy his book?
I never did.
I did once.
Yeah. Was it worth buying?
No, especially from a college bookstore where they're going to charge you an arm and a leg.
Yeah.
All right, got that off my chest. Sometimes when we record live episodes where we're speaking to an audience, we get off track and start talking, and maybe we don't explain things as thoroughly as we should, but we're having fun. So anyway, Debbie, now you said this during the talk we gave at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center.
And anything you buy in a container has been grown in soilless mix. You'll find people who will say, I like to put some soil in because it adds some life to the soil. That's okay, but sometimes that life needs to be only a little bit. I'd say less than 20%. If you want to do that, I don't do it. I don't advocate it, but some people really want to do it. But it has to be sterilized. They think it adds life, but some of that life it adds is bad life. There's good fungus and bad fungus. There's good bacteria and bad bacteria. There's good seeds and bad seeds, meaning weed seeds and the seeds you want to grow. And you can introduce all of those bad things in by adding any of the soil out of your garden. So we don't do it.
So my question to you, after listening to that some people may have been wondering about, and we should explain it. How do you sterilize soil?
Yeah, good question. It is doable, and there's actually you can pasteurize soil, which kills many things but not everything in the soil, and you can sterilize soil, which kills everything in the soil. They actually make soil sterilizers that produce steam, so the process requires moist heat. And I had one when I was working in a greenhouse at the Skill Center. It wasn't very big. We sterilized some of our container soil in it, but we never did field soil in it. But you could. You put it in and you turn it on, and it pumps steam through the media. And if you get to 180 degrees for 30 minutes, that kills most organisms in the soil. So that would be pasteurization. 212 degrees, that's boiling point, right?
Yeah.
Remember that boiling point of water? For 30 minutes, that sterilizes the soil and it kills everything in the soil. So
is that a good thing?
Well, the people who want to put field soil into their container mix for the live things would only want it pasteurized, not sterilized. But if you suspect there are disease organisms in the soil, you would want to sterilize it because disease organisms are live and you don't want any of those alive.
I would think you would also not want to use your kitchen oven to try this.
Right. You can, and you can find the recipe on the internet. It uses a lot of energy and it smells bad, and the smell doesn't go away as soon as you take it out of your oven. It kind of hangs around for days. So be careful.
And besides that, ovens, I don't think, go down to 140 degrees.
Yes, I think you're right. Well, no, I think they do.
It depends on the oven.
Probably, yes.
You, in the past, have mentioned a way, if you're pasteurizing the soil, how to do it to help mitigate the smell.
Yeah, Penn State, I looked up, some information about doing it in the oven because I've never done it. And so there was something from Pennsylvania State University, which is the land-grant college for the state of Pennsylvania. And that's where they do all this agriculture and horticulture research at land-grant universities. So they say to pasteurize soil, preheat it to the oven to 180 degrees, fill a pan with about 4 inches of moist soil. Moist is critical. Cover it with aluminum foil. Insert a candy or meat thermometer to monitor the temperature and place the pan in the oven. When the temperature reads 180 degrees, so that means the soil is 180 degrees, leave the pan in the oven for 30 minutes longer, then remove it and allow the soil to cool. Seeds can then be sown in the soil, or it can be used as a transplant medium for seedlings. Soil that has been sterilized is critical for seed starting mix. So even if you wanted to reuse your container media for seed starting, I would go through this process of sterilizing it.
In the October 13th, 2023 edition of the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast, we take a look at some of the tomato varieties that gardeners had a lot of success with this past summer. And we mentioned those tomato varieties that, were failures. Of course, all gardening is local. Your results may vary. But we'll mention some that might be worth trying in your own yard, wherever you might be. And in today's newsletter podcast, we talk with local nursery owner Don Shore about his own tomato successes and failures this year, as well as the ones his customers mentioned. And we talk about the springtime issue of Jalapeno Gate. You remember that, where there were a lot of mismarked sweet and hot pepper plants and seeds that were sold? Well, it may have been a lot more extensive and may have included some tomato and other plant varieties. If you're already a Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter subscriber, it's probably in your email waiting for you right now. Or you can start a subscription. It's free. Find the link to the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. It's in today's show notes. Or look on the Substack app. And you can sign up at the newsletter link at our homepage, gardenbasics.net. Speaking of seed starting, also when we were talking out there at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, you stated this.
So we use soil-less mix. And soil-less mix is basically 3 parts. You look up any recipe, you break it down. The Cornell University recipe is probably the most commonly used as a basis. It's 3 parts. It's organic matter is 1 part. So that can be peat moss. Where I worked in Oregon, it was shredded wood. It can be compost. It can be coir, which is Coconut, yeah, the stuff outside of a coconut. Comes in pellets, apparently. I don't use coir much. We did when I was teaching, and it was a pain in the butt because you have to soak it for 24 hours before. So you have to, and then we only use part of it, and then we have this bucket of soaking coir, and now what are we going to do with that? So it became sort of a pain in the butt. So anything that's organic, 1/3 that, 1 part. I actually buy container media in a bag because it's mostly organic matter. 1 part of that into this is a kitty litter box. Okay. This is my little one. I have a big one too.
We're saving money here.
Yeah. I buy regular stuff. Don't need anything special.
You've always talked about mixing soil for planting.
Right.
Would you ever use a commercial container media straight?
Right. So to go on, I did say I buy container media in a bag because it's mostly organic matter, and then I do mix it with other things to put in my containers to grow my plants. The one time I use it straight is for seed starting. I start most of my seeds in 6-packs because I like to isolate the root system of each plant. So I have 1 plant. I don't need a lot of seedlings. I'm not running a nursery. So I have 1 plant per cell of the 6-pack. I have washed those 6-packs, and if I'm doing seed starting, I will sterilize them in a 10% solution of bleach. And then I need to use fresh media. And so I will buy seed starting mix. The texture is correct. It's very fine. And it has no known organisms in it. And so that's the one time I will use it. When I move that seedling up from the 6-pack into, let's say, a 4-inch container or bigger, I will use other media.
We're calling this segment Debbie Explains, or in more formal terms, the state versus flower. And so we'll continue with the trial. And you also said this.
So 1 part of that organic matter, 1 part of, I like pumice, comes in this bag. It's lava rock. If you buy some, I'll pass it around. Well, everybody can't see it from here.
All right. But pumice is small.
The pumice comes in sizes,
yeah.
And this is horticultural pumice, and so it is a certain size. Pumice is good for holding moisture, but also creating open spaces in your media. And so I would do 1 part of pumice, put that in, and then perlite is an option. I don't have any perlite with me. Perlite is heated and expanded rock. It's white. And the reason I don't like it, I have some around for various special situations, but it's very, very dusty. To the point where I've inhaled it and coughed for days afterwards. It's not just I have to get it out of my system right now. It goes on and on. The dust is really irritating. And so I would have students water it down when we worked with it. But that didn't work well enough. So I tried to get away from it. So I use vermiculite, which is a different expanded rock. This it's expanded mica. Mine is wet. It holds moisture as well. So we've got 1 part of the organic matter, 1 part of the pumice, 1 part of the vermiculite. I could use sand. I could use, instead of any of these, what else would you use? The perlite we talked about. And mix that together. And that's a good planting mix. You're going to need some nutrition at some point, but that's a good basic planting mix.
Well, the question begs itself. At what point do you need nutrition? How can you tell when that soil mix that you started with needs nutrition?
Right. The soil mix, unless you're buying a brand that advertises there are nutrients in the bag of soil mix doesn't have nutrition in it. When you're starting seeds do not need nutrition. They have all the food that the baby plant inside the seed needs. The food is also inside the seed. But once that plant gets above ground and starts making chlorophyll and making plant food, it needs nutrition. And so you would fertilize the newly germinated seedling right then when the plant is above ground. If I'm transplanting from one container to another, then I will mix some time-release fertilizer into the media that I am putting into the new container. I will look at the label. It gives an amount, so much per so much media, so much fertilizer per so much media. I'll use less, maybe half of that. You can always add nutrition. I like fish emulsion to fertilize with. You can always add nutrition on top, water it in, but you can't take it out once you've put it into the media. So I always go light on that.
Are you referring to fish emulsion as a time-release fertilizer or a slow-release fertilizer?
No, the time-release fertilizer is the pellets that come in a bag or a container, and you put those in and they release over time. The fish emulsion is a slow-release fertilizer because it is an organic fertilizer and has to be acted on by microorganisms to break down and release the nutrients. If you look at the label of any fertilizer, it will, on the back, usually, it has a chart that tells you, a table that tells you what the fertilizer is. All fertilizer bags will have an active ingredients listing, and they will say soluble nitrogen, insoluble nitrogen. The soluble nitrogen is available to the plant immediately.
With water.
With water, yes. Yeah. The insoluble nitrogen must be broken down by microorganisms and to be available for the plant. And so fish emulsion will have probably a larger insoluble nitrogen concentration than soluble. And so the plant will get a little shot right away from the soluble nitrogen, and then the insoluble nitrogen will break down over time and give the plant feeding for a longer period of time. So it's a longer release, but it is not a timed release fertilizer.
Right. So fish emulsion would not be a good substitute then at planting time?
Fish emulsion can be a good substitute at planting time. I'm just lazy, and I don't get out there to fertilize all the time. So I use the pelleted time-released fertilizers so that my plants are getting something even when I've forgotten about them.
All right. And, of course, one thing we talk about a lot when we're doing these personal appearances is soil drainage, and the fact that if you put something at the bottom of the container, that doesn't help drainage. It slows drainage down. And then you said this.
Water moves down through the media. I always think of it as music. I don't know if that works for anybody else. Attached to the sides of the particles and moves down through the texture, whatever texture your media is. When it comes to a drastic change in texture, it stops. And then the water builds up above that.
I always think of it as music. What music is it?
We all have quirks, don't we, Fred? I think because I think of it as a rhythm, that the water will move through the soil if the rhythm in that soil is the same, meaning the texture of that soil is the same from the top to the bottom. And as soon as it meets a different texture, which would be the gravel in the bottom, the styrofoam in the bottom, the shard in the bottom of the hole, and even the hole in the bottom of the container counts as blocking that rhythm, then it will stop moving and it starts to build up what's called a saturation layer above that change in texture.
So that would be a rest in music.
That's a rest stop, yeah.
Yes, all right.
In music, not by the freeway.
Right. See, I would think of it as it's changing keys.
Okay.
As it's going through. If I was to ascertain water traveling through soil as music. And many times you've attempted to explain audially your way of seeing if that old packet of seeds is going to germinate.
Mm-hmm. If you're not sure, you do a germination test. So you take I've done it with paper towels. Fred uses coffee filters. Mm-hmm. I didn't bring one. Okay, this is my paper towel. I lay the seeds, fold it in half.
You're going to make an airplane?
Lay the seeds on the fold. I do 10 because it really makes the math easy. Fold it up. Make a cigar out of it.
You're talented to do that with a microphone in your hand.
I got skills, man. Yeah. Moisten it. Make sure it's wet all the way through. Put a rubber band or something around it and stand it up so the fold is up in the air. In a container, glass container, a mug, and cover the top. You want it to stay moist. And then you check it every day. If it says it's going to germinate in 7 days, you could maybe let it go 2 days. But you want to make sure it does not dry out. A seed that has gotten wet, once it dries, it's dead. So you do not want it to dry out. That's why it needs to be covered with plastic and checked daily for moisture. And then you start checking it and you open it up this way. And the beauty of standing it up in the container is the roots are going to grow down. They grow toward gravity. And so you can tell which seed has germinated. And so after the 7 days have gone by, you open it up and see how many have germinated. If all 10 germinated, you got 100% germination, go ahead and plant them. And you can use these. You can just cut them apart and plant them in the ground. They'll be stuck to the paper towel or the coffee filter, but they will still work.
And I always wonder if people are really grasping how you are doing it. I was going to actually film you. Actually, nobody has film anymore. We'll do whatever we do in the 21st century to make video of basically how you see how to determine if seed is viable or not. But then you found a link at Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, and they had about the same method.
Right.
So I can post that and save us both video embarrassment.
Right. The only difference, they use the paper towel, they use the 10 seeds, they make the cigar, fold it, roll it over, wet it, put it in plastic, and the only difference I do is I stand that cigar in plastic upright in a cup or a jar or something, so that the fold in the paper towel end of the cigar is upright, and that's where the seeds are. And I just do that because roots react to gravity. They grow towards gravity, and so the roots will grow down in that paper towel, and when you open it up, it's easier to tell from which seed the roots came. If you lay the whole thing down, the roots will grow every which way because they're flat on the ground and gravity is everywhere. And it's sometimes hard to tell which seed the roots came from. And then when you want to say, well, how many germinated, it's hard to figure that out.
We could go on another scenic bypass here because it just made me think of people who like to plant by the moon, that the gravitational pull of the moon influences the timing of their planting. And that's been going on for centuries.
Right. I'm not well versed in it.
I'm not well versed in it either.
But I did grow up near the water, and tides were very important. If you're going to take a walk on the beach
not grow plants.
Right. Grow under the local bridge, which was very low and had to be raised if you were in a boat of a certain size. But yes. And so people who do it say it has to do with the water flow in the soil. And I don't know.
I don't know either.
Oh, okay.
So that makes two of us. But if it makes you feel good, do it.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, if it works for you, fine.
Exactly. And so many things in horticulture are that way. If it works for you, do it.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead, do it. Well, Debbie has explained a lot to us today. Thank you for being in an explanatory mood, Debbie.
You're welcome, Fred.
The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays. Plus, the newsletter podcast that comes with the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter continues, and that will also be released on Fridays. Both are free, and they're brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you can also sign up for the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter and podcast. That's gardenbasics.net, or you can use the links in today's show notes. And thank you so much for listening.